Thank you very much for the introduction. Good evening from Australia and good morning to everyone listening in Northern Ireland. My name is Myrna and I'm a trade and investment consultant with Foley based in Sydney, and I will be talking today about Australia's healthcare sector and opportunities for Northern Irish companies. Starting with a brief introduction, just a few general comments about Australia before we get into the main topic of healthcare. As many will be aware, Australia is a large country with a relatively small population of 27 million, expected to reach 31 million in the next 10 years. Australia is a federation of 6 states and 2 territories, and we have 3 levels of government: federal, state, and local, which will also have implications for the health sector we'll be talking about shortly. In terms of trade, Australia is a net importer, with China being our largest two-way trading partner, both in terms of imports and exports, and of course UK, a major trading partner for Australia, our 9th largest source of imports in 2023. When it comes to economy, we like to say that Australia is punching well above its weight. We were the 13th largest economy in 2023, and Australia's GDP growth has constantly outperformed most other Western economies. Obviously, during the COVID-19 pandemic, Australia experienced significant decline in GDP. However, the economy has since recovered, and while the growth has slowed down a bit, it still remains positive. And now moving into the health space, compared to other developed nations, Australia is among the leading countries for public health expenditure per capita. We can see here Australia ranking within the top 5 in 2023, just ahead of the UK at number 6 and Canada at number 7. In the 2024 World Index of Healthcare Innovation, Australia was ranked 9th overall, and we performed particularly well in the categories of quality and choice. And we were also well recognized for medical research, clinical trial capabilities, and we have a vibrant medtech and biotechnology sector. So you must be thinking, why should Northern Irish companies think of Australia as their next export market? And besides some obvious advantages of Australia, I'm just going to highlight a few points here. We have a healthcare system that faces significant challenges due to rapidly aging population, increased burden of chronic diseases, which are all expected to increase our domestic demand for healthcare and medical technology. And over the past few years, the Australian government and state governments have committed record funds towards new and upgraded health and hospital infrastructure facilities, both in metropolitan areas, but also in regional locations. And our limited manufacturing capability also means that we are heavily reliant on imports for medical products. More than 85% of all medical products are coming from overseas, and over half of all imports are coming from the US and Germany, which I guess speaks to the demand for high quality and advanced medical technologies. Australia also invests significant funding into health and medical research. We have a 22 billion cumulative long-term investment fund, which supports health and medical innovation. And Australia is also considered to be a low-risk test bed to develop and test medical technology products, with relatively streamlined regulatory environment and less stringent requirements, particularly for lower-risk medical devices, which allows companies to trial their technologies and early-stage innovations. I mentioned previously, we have a 3-tiered government system in Australia: federal, state, territory, and local councils, and they all share responsibility for running our health system. Our main federal government agency is Department of Health and Aged Care, and there are also some other agencies in the health portfolio. Some of the key responsibilities on the federal government level are developing our health policies and strategies, funding the public healthcare and hospital services, subsidizing aged care sector, including residential and home care services, and also regulating medicines and medical devices, which will be very important for Northern Irish suppliers. So our national regulatory body, TGA, is equivalent to US FDA, is also part of the federal health portfolio. Federal government funds, as mentioned, health and medical research, and also operates and funds our Medicare universal healthcare scheme, through which the government subsidizes medical services, public hospitals, and some medicines. And then moving to the next level are the state and territory governments, which each have their own state and territory health departments that run public health systems in their jurisdictions. So state and territory health departments manage public hospitals and health facilities through a network of local health districts or hospital networks. They're called different in different jurisdictions. An example of that being Southeastern Sydney Local Health District, one of the 6 districts in the Sydney metropolitan area, and one of the largest local health districts in New South Wales. And they deliver healthcare services to nearly 1 million residents and manage a total of 9 hospitals. And likewise, there's similar districts or networks in other states and territories. And of course, we have the emergency medical services in Australia that are also provided by state ambulance agencies. I wanted to highlight a few trends when it comes to health expenditure in Australia. After the COVID-19 pandemic, our health spending returned to the pre-pandemic trends pretty much in 2022, 2023. An estimated total of 252 billion Australian dollars was spent on health goods and services in 2022, 2023, which is approximately 10% of our national GDP. About 70% of this total funding was provided by the governments, with the remaining 30% provided by non-government sources, including insurance, private health insurance, and out-of-pocket expenses, etc. In terms of the major areas for health spending, the majority is spent on public and private hospitals, 43%. Then we have primary healthcare, 33%, and the remaining funding spent on other services, research, capital spending. And then when we look at the right-hand side, in terms of where the money's being spent, I guess the most, New South Wales and Victoria account combined for more than 50% of all total health expenditure in Australia, which makes sense as these states also represent more than half of the Australian population. A few comments I wanted to make on our federal health budget released in May 2024, which allocated significant funds to our health sector, estimated at 112 billion, and projected to increase to 122, almost 123 billion in 2027, 2028. And again, you can see just a few sort of key components of the budget going towards state health support, funding state public hospitals, Medicare, aged care, and also, again, health and medical research. But one thing I wanted to briefly mention here is our medical science co-investment plan. In April last year, the federal government released a plan as part of their commitment to boost our domestic manufacturing capability. And the plan aims to support the development of manufacturing in Australia in the medical science sector. So the money will predominantly focus on several priority areas, including digital health, medical devices, and complex therapeutics. An example here of a state health budget. We talked about federal, every state and territory also publishes their health budgets. So the state of Victoria made a record $13 billion investment in their state's public health system. And again, we talked about infrastructure. There's $1.7 billion allocated towards improving health infrastructure across the state. There's also other key elements, ambulance services, disability, mental health, and even funding towards protecting health services from cyber attacks. So as a medtech manufacturer or supplier, it is important that you're aware of the hospital landscape when you think about who your end customers are. And you want to think about the hospital distribution throughout Australia, funding they receive, and also perhaps specialized clinics that may be relevant to a specific area of your medtech. So all of this might enable you to prioritize introducing your technologies in those states with health facilities that have the funding, and they also have the capacity to support these technologies. So we have our public and private hospital sectors. Public, as mentioned, is managed by our state government health agencies. And you can see here on the screen examples of some of our large public hospitals. On the other hand, we have a similar number of private hospitals, whereas private hospital sector is quite fragmented. It consists either of hospital groups, such as Ramsay and Healthscope, which operate multiple hospitals under one company. And then we have individual or unaffiliated hospitals, which also can vary in size. Private hospitals are owned and operated by private organizations, either for-profit or not-for-profit organizations like St. Vincent's Health. And you probably will be aware that Ramsay and Healthscope are the biggest private hospital operators in Australia. So I guess entering the Australian medical device or medtech market will require significant planning, but also in-depth understanding of our healthcare system, procurement processes, also compliance with national, local regulations, etc. So I guess TGA, or regulatory approval process, that we will talk about in a few minutes, is maybe even the most critical part of this process. But after obtaining your TGA approval, there are many different pathways for your medical technology to be procured by our public or private healthcare systems. I won't go into too much detail when it comes to this diagram on the screen, but it basically outlines different pathways for medtech entering the Australian market in various stages, from regulatory approvals, reimbursement, and finally reaching your end customers. I do want to make a few general comments about procurement, particularly public versus private sector. Public health procurement is, as mentioned, again, managed at state or territory level. There are certain differences in agency structures and practices, but basically medtech companies or distribution companies supply to healthcare providers in public sector either through direct engagement or negotiated purchasing contracts. And what's interesting about Australia is that some states, such as Victoria and New South Wales, have dedicated central procurement agencies for their public health sectors that basically act on behalf of hospitals for certain high volume or commonly used products. And examples here include HealthShare New South Wales, HealthShare Victoria. For the rest, for other products that don't fall under these procurement agencies, hospitals generally manage their own procurement. And market engagement activities are market engagement activities that are undertaken in the procurement process will depend on many things, including the complexity of the procurement, budget, timeline, etc. And if they do go out to the market, states and territories will publish tenders, and each state and territory will have its own tendering and procurement platform, which is often a good starting point for suppliers to look for opportunities. And of course, it should be noted that some state and territory governments or their health agencies are open to unsolicited proposals as well. And of particular note, I guess, to note in our suppliers, that many procurement agencies and public hospitals will publish their procurement activity plans on their websites, and that also provides an indication of possible sourcing activities for the next financial year, or in some cases several years ahead. And on the other hand, we have private health sector organizations, hospitals, clinics, aged care providers, etc. And they typically use a combination of direct procurement and supply arrangements, which is, I guess, the most typical path, and then also public approach to market or tender. However, one difference is that private sector tenders tend to be invitation only. And hospitals and health facilities in the private sector typically work with established network of suppliers and distributors, but some of them also may decide to purchase products directly from manufacturers. So Northern Irish medtech suppliers or the local distribution partners can access private healthcare sector either through responding to contract tenders or approaching providers for procurement opportunities. And that means typically direct engagement with hospitals, their procurement teams and clinical staff. And just a very sort of brief example, again, using the state of Victoria as an example, their Department of Health delivers health services through, I believe, 80 hospital and health services across the state, and that covers both metropolitan and rural and regional areas. And as mentioned before, HealthShare Victoria is a procurement organization that manages standing offer contracts for a variety of products. And outside of these product categories, health and hospital services in Victoria are free to make their own purchasing decisions. So medtech suppliers or their distributors should review HealthShare Victoria's website and see if your offering aligns with any available standing offers, contracts or tenders. And if so, then you can register as a supplier on their website. And you will be notified of any opportunities, any upcoming contracts or tenders. And you, again, may also want to keep up to date with their procurement activity plan. And another option is if you're offering a product or technology does not align with those contracts, standing offer contracts, then another solution is to approach hospitals directly. So I guess there's probably more that can be said about procurement and different pathways, but I guess with this slide, I'd like to conclude the first part of my presentation. I believe we'll hear a bit more about the regulatory environment, TGA, and then we'll continue with opportunities in Australia in digital health and medical technology.